Hello, everyone. Um, Welcome to the third lecture in our lecture series, Thinking with Sand. And as I intro, feel free to go into the chat and say where you're joining from. I am talking from Cambridge, Massachusetts, and um, I'm really excited for uh, this talk series, this talk with Maggie Appleton. It's our second to last talk in the series. And I wanted to also say that we also have a talk next week with Amelia Wattenberger, who's working on LLMs and pushing how we can use them to organize our thoughts and our ideas in innovative ways, specifically using web tools. So, this talk series is done through the MIT Media Lab, where I am a part of in a group called Future Sketches, which is a group that works with software as a medium for art, led by Zach Lieberman. We are the group that also it works at the intersection of technology, art, and design. It's a little bit of a short notice, but we are accepting applicants. So I guess this is a reminder if you've been thinking about submitting your application. The deadline is the 15th. We're looking for new master's students. And I'm very, very excited today to introduce Maggie Appleton. I've been a big fan of Maggie's work for a while since since Zach gave me her book, her essay in the Dark Forest Theory of the Internet. And also her thought piece on, or her essay on tools for thought and software tools was a big inspiration for the talk series name, Thinking with Sand. So I'm going to read her bio now. So Maggie sits at the intersection of design, anthropology, and programming, creating illustrated essays that explore how technology shapes our world through cultural symbols and metaphors. While she leads design and engineering at Normally, an AI-focused design studio, her work spans digital gardening, end-user programming, and the role of embodied cognition in digital interfaces. So as Maggie's giving her talk, please feel free to write your questions in the chat, and then I'm going to compile them, and then I'm going to relay those questions to her after the talk. And so with that, everyone, so please welcome Maggie.
Right. Okay, I'm going to try to share my screen, and we're going to hope that this works correctly. You can all see my slides? Great. Okay. And I'm just going to move the floating heads out the way for a second. Okay. So yeah, this talk is called Tools for Thought as Cultural Practices, Not Computational Objects. Luckily, Shara just did my intro for me, so I can just skip this bit. But I'm primarily a designer. I also call myself a media developer, and I originally trained in cultural anthropology, which influences a lot of how I see my work. As mentioned, I'm a design engineer at a research and design agency called Normally. We do a lot of early stage design and prototyping work, mainly at the moment, exploratory AI products and capabilities for kind of bigger companies. So I get to see a wide range of people attempting to AI things. And I'm enthusiastic about many things: digital gardening, visual programming, end user programming, and conceptual metaphors, which will come up later. So I want to try to do a poll. I'm going to see if I can steal your faces. Who here has heard of the phrase tools for thought? Can you try to emoji react in Zoom if you can find that button at the bottom? Pick any emoji reaction you like. I can see a grid of your faces. Just like pop on whatever you like if you've heard of the phrase. I'm seeing a bunch of them. Okay. Okay, we've got like 20%. That's pretty good. Or I can't see everyone's face. Maybe I'm not getting a good read. I wish Zoom had better polling features, but that gives me a good read. And considering that this is a lecture series on tools for augmented thinking, and that people here are either affiliated with MIT or familiar with the Media Lab, I will assume I'm going to be talking to you as maybe potential creators of tools for thought, even if you don't know much about this specific phrase yet. I'm also going to assume a little bit of computer science background and history, maybe more than most other places, but I will also make sure I give links and citations to everything at the end, and we're going to send out the slides afterwards. So don't worry about catching everything if I like mention a book and it flies by. Okay, so Tools for Thought is a few things. It is first and foremost a philosophical dream with a long history about what happens when you give humans really well-designed tools that expand the kinds of thoughts they're able to think. Secondly, in recent years, it's become a gathering point for a set of complementary communities. These include personal knowledge management, interaction design and HCI, computer-supported collaborative work, and then a bunch of people who are really interested in knowledge graphs and graph databases. It has also now become a category of software and computational objects in the spreadsheets of VC firms, and a thing that they're pretty liberally willing to throw money at. So the recent hype around this phrase first started in around 2019. Around that time, two fairly well-known researchers, Andy Matuszak and Michael Nielsen, wrote this very long, comprehensive essay on the history of tools for thought that gave it a lot of renewed interest. In it, they give readers a sweep through a lot of the major thinkers and events in computing history, like Douglas Engelbart's work and Alan Kay, and they made this plea for more people to start exploring the space of computing systems that augment the human intellect. Around the same time, this is 2019, a new note-taking app came up called Rome Research that started to gain traction, and it aligned itself with this phrase, tools for thought. It looked a little bit ugly, if I'm honest, and it had, at times, terrible performance, but it did some really interesting things well that at the time seemed novel. The first was bidirectional links or backlinks, so that when you link to a page, you can see what pages are linking to it. And it used an outliner format where each piece of content was a single node, and that node can be linked anywhere else in the graph and embedded anywhere, so it was very flexible. It also had this big, crazy graph view that kind of showed you all the connections between your notes, and the entire thing was multiplayer. So the founders were experimenting with what at the time seemed like quite novel ways of interacting with hypertext. But some of you might recognize that a lot of these ideas are actually quite old. I mean, not in the span of human time, but they had a lot of precedence in the 80s and 90s, particularly with like Ted Nelson's work on Xanadu or a lot of the early hypertext experiments. And Rome was trying to resurface these ideas that had never really taken hold yet. And they had quite a compelling goal. They were trying to give people a better tool for developing ideas collaboratively and synthesizing them across a wide range of information. So they were trying to enable a kind of bottom-up thinking and emergence. So off the back of Rome, we kind of had this new kick of note-taking hype cycle. We suddenly got a bunch of new note-taking startups that all proclaimed to be new tools for thought. So for example, this is Muse, which was a bit more canvas and drawing based, but also had a lot of rich hyperlinking capabilities. This is Anytime, so this one's more focused on structured data, but very similar features to the others. This is Cosmic. This was another canvas-based one. This is Reflect, promising that you can think better with it. So even some of these, if they didn't directly use the phrase tools for thought in their marketing, the creators of these tools understood they were now supposed to be in the business of making people think better. It's another one from Clover, another one from Logseek. These all ended up being quite similar, promising to increase your understanding. So there were a bunch of these, more than I could show here, and they were all released roughly within the last 5 years, probably with the exception of Notion on their screen. And this phrase, tools for thought, started to feel synonymous with these experimental note-taking apps. They were all promising that their features would lead to better thinking, better quality thoughts, better memory, and more emergent connections between topics. We also got an endless pile of influencers making YouTube videos teaching you how to use these apps and set up really elaborate organizational systems. The surge also led to more funding. So BetaWorks hosted an accelerator for about a dozen tools for thought companies in New York. And essentially, this tools for thought idea became what could be called an idea machine. Idea machines are a concept that Nadia Aspahuva coined in an essay in 2022. And this means an ideology that is backed by raw, tangible resources, meaning people, companies, software, and money. She used examples like effective altruism or Web3, but I think you could also say the Catholic Church counts as this. These are ideas with power behind them. They are something we can name and point to and gather resources around. And I'm really glad that Tools for Thought has become a financially backed, powerful movement because it is a worthwhile cause. But I think the current understanding of it has some limitations and needs some redirection. So here's the big question that this talk is going to be asking. What if we consider tools for thought as sets of cultural practices rather than computational objects? I'm coming at this from an anthropology and design perspective, and I'll say that I'm very much a part of this community of people using and building this kind of software. Like, I was an early user of Roam, and I personally know a lot of the people building these tools for thought companies. So I do feel obliged to critically interrogate it a bit. So the term of the community around it has grown significant enough. They were all walking around with a lot of assumptions about the meaning and the mission of this phrase and what kind of work it requires. But I think thinking about it in different ways, we might, interpreting the term differently, could lead us to very different paths about what we choose to work on and what we choose to build. So one of the first critical questions we should ask is, what does tools for thought have to do with computers? The phrase itself implies nothing about computation or digital objects. It's simply tools that help humans think new kinds of thoughts. If we take that definition at face value and try to come up with examples of tools for thought, we have to conclude that most of them precede computing by thousands of years. If you think about written language, Hindu Arabic numerals, songs and poetry used as oral history, data visualization, Cartesian coordinates, spreadsheets, the Socratic method, maps, memory palaces, spaced repetition, Zettelkasten, I could go on. But all of these are pre-computational. Just to explore a few of these in specific, Hindu Arabic numerals made accounting and record keeping possible, right? Calculations could be stored and shared and referenced, enabled everything we do in bureaucracy. We've used song and poetry to extend memory and pass stories between generations before written language appeared. So bards would use rhetorical techniques and metric rhythm to make stories easy to recite. And this is how we got pieces like the Epic of Gilgamesh or the Mahabharata surviving long enough to eventually be written down. Maps have enabled humans to mentally navigate space very differently. They gave us what can be called an allocentric view, so a bird's eye view of a space, as opposed to an egocentric view from an individual's perspective. And that allowed us to construct mental maps of much larger spaces that we can't directly see. Cartesian coordinates, again, this is Rene Descartes gave this after watching a fly circle around his room. He thought about how you might grid those on a map. And this makes us able to describe points in space with specific numbers, which allows you to do things like model objects that don't exist, and allows us to precisely map Earth and to refer to points on Earth, which led to GPS. There's also the Zettelkasten that's got quite popular at the time. This is also known as a slip box. It's a technique from around the 18th century where you write atomic notes on individual index cards. You keep them all in this big box called a slip box, and you assign each card an ID, and then you can use those to link cards together to create deeply interconnected ideas. And this one became especially popular in the transition to hyperlinking and digital notes. So all of the things I've just listed are actually cultural practices and systems, not technological objects. They enable us to relate to information and representation in new ways, thus enabling new kinds of thoughts. But they aren't technological objects like hammers or compasses. They're practices that people developed and passed down to one another through culture. And most of the things that we're enamored with right now around tools for thought are actually the practices that we do inside these new tools rather than the tools themselves. So most of the YouTube thought leaders turn out to be teaching very specific kinds of techniques, like how to build a Zettelkasten, rather than teaching us how to use a specific piece of software. And it's still unclear how much of the enabling the software is doing versus the cultural practice. The same goes for spaced repetition. There are guides on how to do this on every kind of software imaginable, but we can't quite tell if it's the app or the practice that's enabling people to improve their memory. So we're in a kind of interesting place where all of this software is being called tools for thought, and most of the community is very focused on building more software. But it seems like these cultural practices are the real tools for thought. What we're exploring here is the relationship between the computer as a medium and the cultural practices we do within that medium, and which of those we should be focusing on. So we're still on this question, right? Like, what does any of this have to do with computers? To understand why we're confused, I think it's worth going back to the origins of the phrase and the people who proposed that we should start paying attention to the idea. Because tools for thought as a concept is deeply rooted in computer science and HCI. Its major advocates have pretty much all been programmers. The first person to use the phrase was Kenneth Iverson, who talked about tools for thought all throughout the 1950s and 60s, and wrote this paper, Notation as a Tool for Thought, which was published by the ACM in 1980. And in it, he talks about mathematical notation as the best known and best developed example of a tool for thought. Around the same time period of the 1950s and 60s, Douglas Engelbart wrote this very famous piece, Augmenting the Human Intellect. And his thesis was that computers should help us approach complex situations, gain comprehension, and to derive solutions to problems, very much in the tools for thought philosophy. Alan Kay picked up on a lot of this philosophy and applied it while developing the foundations of most of our current computing environments at Xerox PARC. He wrote this paper, User Interface, A Personal View in 1989, where he talked about his vision for the potential of computing mediums, which can be summed up in this quote: "The very use of it would change the thought patterns of an entire civilization." There's a book called Tools for Thought that Howard Rheingold wrote, which is a comprehensive summary of a lot of this history. This was published in 1985. A lot of it is about the birth of personal computers and a lot of the people I just mentioned. Now, after this point, Tools for Thought goes a bit more quiet in the 1990s. There's not a lot written on it that's publicly available. But around 2013, Brett Victor, who I'm sure many of you have heard of, starts doing his talks, which kind of, for the newer generation, become canon. So talks like The Humane Representation of Thought and Media for Thinking the Unthinkable, these are published between 2013 and 2015, become new pieces of canon in people interested in tools for thought work. Now, all of these programmers are pushing this idea that we need to be building new tools for thought. And most of the people listening to them or reading their work are computer people, designers and programmers. And so I think we end up assuming that the problem and the solution are both computer shaped. Another interesting thing about the way these programmers are talking about tools for thought is that they're actually talking about a medium for thought, not necessarily a tool. Philosophical clarity, I think these two are slightly different. Mediums are a material that we use to communicate ideas, right? These are like film, painting, programming, writing. Whereas tools enable specific workflows. You don't communicate through a hammer or through the agile method. They are part of a larger context, a medium. And I think it's important to be clear on the difference between these two when we talk about tools for thought as a category, because humans have used thinking to expand their thinking in both ways, and they're both part of the picture. I think it's more accurate to say that the thinkers I've referenced so far are mainly talking about a computational medium for thought, where the computerness and the mediumness are actually critical elements to it. So it would be CMFT rather than TFT, which is less catchy. But I kind of think about it like this, that tools for thought is the larger category that expand human ways of thinking and cognition, and computational mediums for thought are one subsection of that. So why are they so focused on computers, right? What's so special about computers, and why might they be especially well suited to expanding thought? I think this is best answered by this Alan Kay quote: "The computing can dynamically simulate the details of any other medium. It is not a tool, although it can act like many tools. It is the first meta-medium." We encode cultural practices in computation, and it reconfigures and expands and transforms them, right? The meta-medium changes the practice. Trying to navigate through the world with paper maps versus trying to navigate through the world with Google Maps, you'll realize that there are many more affordances and details and ways of expanding your understanding in Google Maps. We have to acknowledge that there's something very different about computing. It's the ability to create representations from the world that we can explore and manipulate, freed from many of the constraints of physical mediums. If we think about a Zettelkasten, which is the form of note-taking that I mentioned earlier, I think it would be slightly absurd to deny the fact that a digital Zettelkasten or note-taking system has very different affordances to a physical one, even if they're based on the same cultural practice. A digital one will have full text search, it'll have dynamic views, you can copy and paste things, right? I have a backup in case there's a fire. At this point, I can integrate a language model into it. So the computational version changes what we're able to do and clearly expands our capacity in some way. But even though computing expands some of the practices, we shouldn't forget that we're still recreating cultural practices that existed outside of computing first. So maps and spreadsheets and Zettelkastens all existed before computers, and computers just became amplifiers or enablers of them. And at the moment, there's a lot of staring really, really hard at the computer, thinking about what the computer can do, thinking about software and interfaces, and novel ways to store and retrieve data, which is necessary to some extent, but there's not a lot of attention being put on the cultural practices that we're trying to represent. We're currently enabling actually a fairly small range of activities when we look at it. We're trying to enable capturing information, organizing information with links and tags, retrieving information, remembering information, searching for new information, synthesizing ideas, and generating ideas. I'll put asterisks on the last three here because I want to argue that we're not actually very good at these last three at the moment, but that's primarily what people are trying to use AI and language models to do, although I'll come back to the AI thing in a minute. And these activities that I've listed, they all serve a very particular flavor of text-based knowledge work. This is work that is based around research and written output that specifically has a textual focus, right? This is helping people write documents and code and presentation slides. And it's very useful for certain kinds of people like academics and social scientists and journalists and consultants and VCs and programmers, right? At the moment, we are mostly designing tools for ourselves. And it feels like we're not exploring computational mediums for thought as much as we're exploring a very small subset of it that I'm going to call computational mediums for white collar knowledge work, or CMFWCK for convenience, which means it's clear we need to expand our view of this field a little bit and explore the rest of the Venn diagram. So the big question is, how do we help the tools for thought community diversify? How do we help move the community beyond computers for text-based white-collar knowledge work? And I have three overarching ideas of how we can start to do this. I think if we're trying to look at what enables novel kinds of human thought, to me, that is an anthropological and cognitive science question, not a computing question. At the moment, most people in this space are trying to innovate without learning much about the world outside of software, or even the world outside of cool hyperlinks in web apps. I think the field would benefit a lot from a much wider lens on the problem, and specifically looking at theories like embodied cognition, extended mind theory, and looking at examples of cross-cultural ways of thinking from ethnographic research. I think this could add a lot to our conception of tools for thought. So just to name a few people that we could start to use to ground tools for thought in this more cognitive science anthropology approach, I think philosophers like Andy Clark are really good. He's written extensively about human cognition interacts with the environments around us. This book, Natural Born Cyborgs, looks a bit dated at this point, but all the content inside it is still extremely prescient and relevant. It's not his only book on the subject. He's also done Supersizing the Mind, but I think this one is actually one of the more accessible ones to look at. In it, Clark presents this idea of the extended mind hypothesis and says that we don't necessarily think just inside our brains, but we think in relationship between our brains and our bodies and the world around us and the interaction between them. I think another really good one to look at is George Lakoff's research on embodied metaphors as the foundation of all conceptual thought. This book is actually quite short. Some bits of it do get hard to read, but it will make you rethink the way you understand how abstract thought is constructed and the role of the body in that. Lakoff and Johnson argue that everything is grounded in our embodied experience, which certainly has implications for AI, but again, I will not get into that at the moment. Similarly, I think Barbara Tversky's book, Mind in Motion, is really great here. She's done an enormous amount of extensive research on how thinking happens through the body and how action and motion in the body enable new kinds of thinking. She's done a lot of observational and experimental research on this too. I think both this book and almost any of the other existing research on embodied cognition will convince you that the way humans think is deeply tied to our physical interactions with the world. So understanding space, color, light, sound, texture, and rich visual inputs. I want to say, I imagine none of this is news to people who are maybe part of this research group or part of the media lab. You know bodies are important, but not everyone in the software field does. Some notable others include anthropologist Tim Ingold, who's done a huge amount of research on how humans build technologies and skills in relationship with their environments. There's Bruno Latour, who's another anthropologist who worked on active network theory. Maurice Merleau-Ponty, very famous for setting the foundations of body cognition. Of course, I think we all know Marshall McLuhan, very famous for helping clarify how mediums and communication relate. And then Don Norman came up with the idea of cognitive artifacts. Again, probably already very popular in this field. I'll say this is not a comprehensive list, but I think it's a good starting point. I think one of the most useful things we could do as the Tools for Thought community is to spread around the knowledge that these thinkers have already established and to reference it more and use it more as a foundation of our work. And the reason that I think we're not doing that at the moment is because I look around and I have to ask, where are all the embodied, visual, spatial, and oral tools for thought? Professions that primarily work in non-textual mediums are unlikely to find the current tools for thought on offer profoundly helpful. We, of course, do have some software that serves some of these disciplines I've listed well. We do have spreadsheets for mathematicians and 3D modeling for biologists. And data science, we do have Photoshop for painters. But strangely, I don't see a lot of interaction between people who build those kinds of tools and the tools for thought community. To give you some examples of what I mean, I think I would consider something like AlphaFold from DeepMind a good example of a non-textual spatial tools for thought. So this is the tool that enables you to figure out protein folding. Here's another one of Logic Pro, which is a music platform. And this is actually a video that I highly recommend watching. This is Jacob Collier, who's this extraordinary Grammy award-winning musician. And he does these screen shares on YouTube showing how he builds one of his songs in Logic Pro. This is a breakdown of his song Moon River. It's over an hour, but it's a really excellent example of a computational medium enabling a wildly new kind of musical thought. Of course, we have the new image generators for visual brainstorming and exploring visual culture. These are frankly now dated images from Midjourney. I haven't generated new ones in a while. And I know these are controversial for reasons like copyright that are very valid, but image generators in general, I think, are a really interesting creative thinking tool that are worth exploring and bringing into the tools for thought space. VR is obviously a very promising way of exploring the embodied cognition side of things. I'm going to show you a demo of something called Prisms VR, which is a spatial reasoning tool that teaches kids maths, which is really impressive. So in it, kids are shown how to solve different maths problems, but by being able to point at objects and move them around and see visual groupings and understand things in spatial relationships. So again, this is a really good example of a different kind of tool for thought that is not text-based. This is a quick interlude. I just wanted to point out that I think it's very funny to be in the moment of this AI hype bubble, where the professed goal of burning all these GPUs is to invent thinking machines. And people hope that if we make these machines reason, they'll be able to solve problems better than humans can and solve all our really difficult, nasty problems that we can't solve on our own. And yet we've gone about it in a way that is intensely textual and disembodied by literally only dumping text into these models so that all they know and can produce is text. And language models, right, the primary kind of AI that most people are putting their stock into at this point, lack an understanding of bodies and objects and environments interacting with space over time, which I think the literature shows is core to the way that humans think. Now, I want to say I don't think that means they won't produce useful tools for us, but I don't think they will be able to recreate anything resembling human thinking or human problem solving, at least not without giving them some way to understand embodiment and motion and interaction with the physical world. So I just consider that next time someone tells you that GPT-6 is going to solve climate change. Sorry, interlude over. Okay, so the second way to diversify tools for thought is to build complementary, not competitive cognitive artifacts. So this theory comes from David Krakauer of the Santa Fe Institute. Competitive artifacts are things that do the cognitive work for you and make you reliant on the tool and diminish your skills in the process. They sort of compete with us in a way. They do the hard work for us. Whereas complementary artifacts teach you new cognitive skills while you're using the tool. So they complement your abilities and they make you more capable even when you don't have the tool with you. So a classic example of this is Google Maps versus a compass. So when you're using Google Maps, it doesn't make you better at navigating the world around you. It tells you exactly where to go without relating it to local landmarks or to the position of the sun or helping you develop a sense of direction in the world. If you take Google Maps away, none of us are going to be better at navigating the cities we live in. Whereas a compass makes you look up more, you're not looking at your phone, and it makes you pay attention to the physical world around you. It teaches you how to relate the direction you're moving in to the world like landmarks and the sun, and it teaches you navigation skills that you would retain even if we took the compass away. So I think one prescient example that we could try to apply this to is the current moment we're all having with coding assistants like Copilot or Cursor. I think there are ways in which these tools could be used that could be complementary, but the vast majority of uses that I've seen feel competitive to me. Because most of the time, the way that they're designed, they're not helping you learn how to solve problems programmatically, especially if you're not reading the code that they output, you're just kind of pasting it into the file. And I think it would be really interesting to try to redesign Copilot and focus on making it a complementary tool that could slowly teach you programmatic thinking while doing things like while solving problems in your code without doing things like applying huge code chunks or like rewriting whole files for you, which doesn't involve you in the process enough. So that's a good example of how that could be applied right now. The last thing I think we could do to diversify tools for thought, this is of course the mission of my entire talk, is saying that I need to think we need to pay much more attention to cultural practices, not computational objects. So there are tons of pre-existing, super effective cultural practices that make us better at thinking, and we should be considering how we could enable more people to use them, perhaps with computers, but also perhaps not. So just to give you a few examples of what I think are some underexplored ones. First is spatial memory. We have extremely effective memories when we are able to relate facts to physical space around us. I haven't seen that much exploration of designing tools to help people do something like build memory palaces or relate certain facts to their physical home. We could design tools that enable that, but I haven't seen many. I think classical rhetoric is kind of underrated. This is how the ancient Greeks and Romans developed convincing arguments. We could be building tools that teach us how to use ethos and pathos and logos in our arguments, and how to bring in more alliteration and antithesis and analogies. Another big one, I think, is critical thinking skills. So this is a huge category. But what tools do we currently have that help us do things like question and interrogate claims that we come across, or get us to question our assumptions and prove ourselves wrong, or point out our unconscious biases and logical fallacies? Next, I think statistics and statistical manipulation would be really interesting to explore. So we all famously know most statistics are lies, but being able to understand and interpret statistics is an incredibly powerful tool to understand the massive data that we're all swimming in. And I think most of us, me included, are pretty illiterate in statistics, both making them and reading them. And I would love tools that help me correctly interpret statistics and put the data into context and just have a more critical lens on numbers that I encounter on a daily basis. Information literacy skills, I think, are underrated. Obviously shown to be pretty low across the population at this point, and getting worse all the time with the AI slop filling every single platform. Do any of your current tools help you thoroughly vet the sources and the legitimacy of the information that you encounter on a daily basis? Do they help you compare and contrast arguments you read and come to more informed and synthesized conclusions? And obviously not, they do not, right? Well, at least mine don't. And if yours do, I want to know what apps you're using. There's a lot of places to look for more practices like these. Daniel Dennett actually has a bunch of really good examples in this book called Intuition Pumps and Other Tools for Thinking. He wasn't explicitly referencing any of the pre-existing literature on tools for thought when he wrote this, published in 2013, so actually quite modern. The way he's referring to tools for thought is actually very similar to what I talked about in the beginning, saying things like numbers, words, diagrams, maps, that these are really the tools for thinking. And he's especially interested in this concept of intuition pumps, which is his own term, but means reasoning moves he does to help him think through philosophical problems. These include things like Rappaport's rules, juicing, and rothering. If you want to know what those mean, you'll have to read the book. In other words, I think we should be building tools that give people new lenses on the world, that teach you how to see and think in useful new ways. I know that a lot of the examples I just showed probably fall under the category of critical thinking lenses, but I think you could also teach people to see through an emotional lens or to see the world through the lens of complexity theory and emergence. I think there's a whole bunch of different lenses you could come up with here. To me, these are the most promising tools for thought. That is my whole talk. Thank you very much for listening. And I would love to take questions and hear people's thoughts and opinions on that whole spiel.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. And I even have this sitting right next to me. It was Daniel Intuition Pump's book.
Nice.
That was like a really great. I think there was a lot of really people were really excited about all of the resources that you were talking about, and we talked about this before, but I wanted to mention about the link that we possibly might share. Yes.
Oh yeah, I'll make sure to send slides around later. Usually I have them on my website ahead of time, but time was not on my side today, so
right.
that didn't work
out.
So
we'll have the slide. So we'll have the talk on the link that we've been sharing in the chat. I'll share that again. And then we'll also have the slides linked there too. Here it is. So the first question that we had, which was from Victor, is very short. What is the difference between systems and tech objects in relation to the first couple introductions in your slide?
Okay, I feel like that could be a whole PhD thesis, but I should really have a better answer to that. But yeah, okay, I think of technological objects as I would call software and hardware. I think I was trying to capture both of those in that concept of technological computing objects. Versus systems are much more processes that humans teach each other through culture. So much more, so not something you could touch, but things that are taught through culture.
Amazing. And then the next question it has two parts to it. One part is a question. The next one is a fun fact. So
great.
The question is, I always thought that Tools for Thought was a riff on Tools for Living, the motto of Whole Earth Catalog, or is it the other way around? And then the fun fact from Mark is the Whole Earth Catalog was edited across the street from Engelbart's office at SRI. The Whole Earthers played volleyball against the Engelbarters at lunch.
That's great. I think at some point I heard someone in the chat might know. I think Whole Earth Catalog was put into what is it? It was like the Smalltalk platform. What am I blanking on? The Dynabook. Oh my gosh, my brain's just going. It's clearly the end of Friday. What am I thinking of? Hypercard. Someone correct me. It was Hypercard.
Yes. Amazing. And then another question we had from Leslie. Is there something to notation as a visualization of knowledge / information, Pierre Levy and Becoming Virtual, linked to muddled understandings of how to evaluate these tools for thought, meaning produced in interaction rather than inherent to tool itself?
Sorry, can you rephrase that, or can I go find that to read it? Oh, say it. Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah, I was honestly, I was kind of just like taking notes in the Zoom chat, so sorry for the confusion. But yeah, I'm curious about as you mentioned, right, like the overall, like the predominantly text-based sort of just like culture in all these tools, and whether there's something to how the fact that our culture is so reliant on text for information, if that's what makes evaluating these tools hard, because as long as you're able to process, it's something about how like the focus is on the tool, but not the interaction with the tool itself. And if you have a powerful enough looking interface, it feels like you're empowered to work in a specific way. I don't know. We don't need to go through this. I'm like struggling to form this thought. So, but yeah,
I guess like you're going somewhere though. I'd think about that one more.
Yeah. The question is more about like, the fetishization of knowledge and information and text. Yeah, then we definitely, right. There's something like that. We went down some historical path that was so heavily text-based that we're like now so far along it that it feels like we can't escape it. Like we have just been living in such an intensely textual world for
so long. When I say so long, like maybe hundreds of years. Um, but there are many other possible worlds we could have ended up in, or like could end up in the future that don't have to be so like super texty, which I think is something I'm interested in exploring.
And then another question we had from Thomas in relation to competitive versus complementary example, Google Maps versus a compass. So does that mean that any tool that pulls a user away from an egocentric view and towards an allocentric view is competitive and not complementary? Because without the tool, we always must return to an egocentric view and thus develop a dependence on the tool.
Oh, actually, I don't think so, because I'm thinking of if you take maps away, like outside of Google Maps, just the concept of having a map, which there was a point in history where we didn't have maps, which is a bit difficult to reason about. But I think, if you draw a map of a place, if you think of like, if anyone remembers, like before we had phones, you would like look up a map and draw it on a piece of paper and then like leave the house with the paper map and then like look at the paper map to see where you were going. Again, a very long time ago, but you would sort of memorize like where the streets were, and I think the map helped you understand how to navigate the physical space. So I don't think all bird's eye allocentric views have to be competitive. I think just Google Maps gives you so much specific information, like it just buzzes me to be like turn left now, but it's not giving me a mental map of the space I'm operating within.
Amazing. A question from Mark. Where does information gardening fit into tools for thought?
Oh, I think it's a great tool for thought, one of my favorites. It's definitely not as like embodied and visual and oral as things I would like to see, but information gardening is a really good, I think, critical thinking tool, and Mark will know this well, also a very good gardener. Um, like that's one of the great critical thinking skills. You're trying to like collect information, update it over time, and it gives you this sense of you're actually updating your views and not just staying static in them. So I count it as a really good tool for thought.
And then I think a question we're all thinking this is from Zona. What is the tool you use to organize your thoughts for this presentation? Your slides are so well designed with seamless animations and transitions that make your ideas easy to grasp.
That is great. Let me actually, it's Keynote, which
Nice.
still to this day works, even though I don't think Apple has touched it for many years, if I'm perfectly honest. There are many small frustrations I have with it. But yeah, I just build everything in Keynote, and most of the magic that people love is this magic move transition that just moves objects between slides. I swear this is mostly what does all the good work. And then picking a nice typeface and some like cool little decorators. But Keynote magic move, I say, does most of the work for me.
A question from Leslie. Curious about non-note taking based experiences that may emerge as helpful models for tools for thought. Interested in weird adjacencies and surprising connections that you've identified in other fields.
Oh, okay. Interested in non-note taking. These are the most helpful models for tools for thought. Ooh, I'm not sure about that one. Non-note taking with experiences. I mean, I think, right, so like at the moment, there's a lot of intense focus on note taking in the tools for thought space. And so that does end up being our model is like, what is a tool for thought? Interested in weird adjacencies and surprising connections. I don't know. I'm gonna have to think about that one. I feel like that's quite a good, meaty question that I can't come up with a pithy answer for.
Question from Brino. I'm not sure cultural practices and technology are so different or even separate things. For example, Bitcoin only works because of a social layer. I usually define it as social technology. How do you differentiate this? For example, contract is a cultural practice or a technology.
Okay, yeah, I think this is a good like the difference of words, because I think technology maybe you could count as a cultural practice, like you're saying, like contract is a technology. But I think I'm thinking that when I say computational objects, which I think I try to use more than saying technology because of that looseness to it. Things that are much more artifacts or things you could touch. I mean, you can't touch software, but you kind of can through your mouse. But more concrete things that you actually have as objects versus practices. They're a bit more fluid and social. I mean, obviously they interact and there's a lot of like fuzziness and overlap there, but I do think we can kind of separate those two things.
Amazing. We have a question from Coven, who is the first speaker in our talk series. Coven asks, as we're building tools and using existing ones, what are some ways to move our tools from competitive to complementary? Any principles or approaches to guide us? Perhaps a complementary tool approach for this?
That is a good question. I wish there had been more written on this. Like David Krakauer, who came up with the theory, never wrote a paper on it. He just talks about it in podcasts and in presentations. So he hasn't sort of laid out a kind of academic, thorough theory of like how you would make one more than the other. But I just think going back to that rule of thumb of saying things like, if I took this tool away, would I be more capable without it than I was before? So thinking of tools that like teach you things in the process of using them. I think another thing he talks about is like, he uses the word algorithms. I would maybe say reasoning or ways of working. If you think of like a calculator hides its algorithms from you. You like don't learn how to do calculus better with a calculator. Versus an abacus, you can see how it works and you could draw how an abacus works to your mind even without the abacus there. So that's another good rule of thumb. Is like, is it showing you its inner workings, which becomes very relevant if you think about the current AI tools that we're all building and using. Is like, can you see how they reason? Can you see how they work? Like, I don't think any of us could recreate the capabilities of whatever ChatGPT is doing without ChatGPT there, which makes it, in essence, a competitive technology. So that's like some rules of thumb is, can you take it away and can you see its reasoning?
We have a question around the embodied cognition. So Tommy asks, to me, all digital expressions of tools or thought feel like simulacra to some extent of the cultural exercises and metaphors they're based off of. When trying to reignite the embodied cognition into our tools or thought, what challenges arise from the reignition? And when a lot of our experiences are now based on simulacra versus the original experience.
Yeah, this is a good problem. Oh gosh, I feel like the answer to this is just like, I wish ubiquitous computing had happened, right? Because now we're like also tied to MacBooks and screens and like we're all in this simulacra software world. And we all know we kind of think better with our bodies in space, but our computer is not out here in space in our rooms with us. It's not like out here in our where we could just like take paper and put it all over the walls and like have the same benefits and affordances that we have in the digital world. We can't have those if we move into the physical. So it feels like these two divided worlds. So I'm trying to remember what the question was, but that's the challenge that arises, right? It's like the benefits you get from working in software are so great that it's really difficult to decide to build something outside of it. But the minute that you're in software, you can't really do as much embodied textual lights, colors, like real world stuff. And it's just because we never integrated the physical and the digital.
Yeah. Okay, question from Gregory. Another specific advantage of computational medium is that in theory it is a medium in which you can compute, which you can write and run programs. Cultural practices are inherently malleable, as pre-computational systems like numerals and poetry and the Zettelkasten, yes. But modern apps like Google Maps are not is malleability a necessity, necessary property of the tools for thought that effectively mobilizes cultural practices?
Oh, maybe that's a really good question. I hadn't thought about that as much, except for that, like cultural practices, of course, change over time. So I bet they have a much shorter iteration loop than something that you end up embedding in a piece of technology, like a piece of software or an object. It kind of then the practice stays fixed to the limitations or the affordances of the object. When you have a practice that's much more like rhetorical debate, that can evolve really fast and is really malleable, and people can change it and adapt it to their own needs. And you could probably argue, like, if we did have end user programming, people could adapt and change software to their own needs fast and flexibly. But I feel we're still in the age of software being quite a static thing that you kind of get whatever the program has built for you, and it's a slow update process. So I'd say it's probably a pretty positive property that cultural practices can be mobilized and changed and updated quite fast or faster than technological objects.
Okay, question from Aaron. Why do you think that text has become such a centric representation for these computational objects, given that we have different mediums that convey a lot more information, images, video, and audio?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, why are computers so textual? I feel like this is like I did do once tried to do a conference talk on this a bit. I was trying to explore why programming specifically was so inherently textual and not didn't explore as much with like shape and color, and why visual programming never took off essentially. And kind of chalked it up to like text is just an incredibly efficient format to embed lots and lots of information in. So it just kind of became a limitation of computer memory and space. And that also you just had, I don't know what you call it, you just get stuck in the existing paradigm. So once enough computing was like mostly textual, it's very hard to then go build a computer that's totally based on like graphical symbols and colors, even if that were possible, to be as efficient in communicating information in a graphical space. Everyone went the text route, so we all ended up in a textual world. So that's, I think, one of the reasons that text became so centric. And then as computers became the center of everyone's worlds and running everything, and they're all already textual, that just expands kind of the dominance of text everywhere.
I actually have a question. So in the last talk, Linus talked a lot about like balancing agency versus abstracting like non-essential parts of a tool. And I was wondering, what's your take on balancing information and the transparency versus abstracting?
Oh, interesting. Okay. I haven't caught up with Linus recently, so I'm trying to think of what his like most what his arguments are now for agency so wait, what was it? It was like balancing the amount of agency you have over a
Right,
tool
yeah.
and like abstracting away the complexity.
Yes, yeah. Like how do you
Okay.
kind of strike a balance with that?
Oh, that is a good question. I'm trying to think of it in the context of tools for thought. I do tend to want, it's funny because we do want both. It's like there are definitely moments where I think I really want to own and control and be able to author my own tools for thought. That feels quite important to me. And I imagine it's quite important to anyone doing like really complex or just normal levels of knowledge work or abstract, difficult work. But at the same time, it's overwhelming to try to design your own tools. You kind of go, well, I can't do this all on my own. I have to rely on other people who are smarter than me, having set up frameworks and systems and built software for me that I can use to expand my thoughts and have better ideas. So I probably think there's like some amount of you want agency. Well, I guess only in times where the current tools and systems aren't serving your needs or aren't meeting your needs, which I don't think is all the time, but there'll be some instances where you need to have the ability to like drop down to a lower level of abstraction. To talk in computing terms, right? You like go look inside node modules and like see how the thing actually works. Like if your app is broken. I think some degree of that where you want the complexity abstracted away until something breaks and then you have to go, or it's not working for you correctly, and then you want to be able to have the right and the ability to go drop down into a more agentic level.
Great. Okay, we have one more question, and then I'll let everyone get to their Friday. So this is a follow-up question to around why text has become so text-centric. Could we communicate without the filter of textual processing somehow, and would that be fruitful in some way?
Ooh.
Yeah.
For me, well, I guess we do it in conversation when this isn't an inherently textual interaction at the moment. And I'm sure it'd be fruitful. Actually, I'm sure the lab does a lot of this kind of exploration of like things that are not necessarily textual, like space and movement and light and ways to communicate ideas outside of just doing a piece of writing and reading it. Obviously, because the medium changes, what you're able to communicate and express changes. So you're not really able to like define words or like, I don't know, list out the details of an argument, but probably can communicate emotion and feeling and experience better. Yeah. So there's plenty of things that are non-textual. I think of theater, dance, like acting, that things that don't involve us reading and writing any words that communicate plenty.
Awesome. Well, with that, I want to thank you again for your wonderful talk, and and everyone's asking, we're gonna have the slides and the talk up after it's transcribed. We'll only have to wait like well, actually this one might come out sooner because we're transcribing it, use a different system to transcribe it. So within a week or two, everyone will be able to relive this talk. So, everyone give it up for Maggie. Thank you.
Yay. Thank you for your thoughtful questions. I also love how many people I recognize in the chat. Thank you to everyone who came. Even if I don't recognize you, I appreciate you coming.
Perfect. Okay.